In the previous lesson, we used the getByRole method on our screen object to query our DOM nodes for an element with a role of text box. I want to clarify that an element can get its role in one of two ways, either implicitly or explicitly. So many elements within the browser are going to be assigned a role by default. For example, an input element with a type of text will have the role of text box assigned to it by default. And that's a good thing because we don't have to manually or explicitly specify it in line. At the same time, what we can also do on an element is we can add an attribute called role, and to that attribute we can assign a sample role, such as text box. Now in this scenario, this is an h1 in our app.js file, so this is a header and it's obviously not a text box, so this would be a terrible idea, but I just want to show you that we can assign a role of text box right here, and when I save this and our test suite reruns, we're actually going to get a failure because the getByRole method right here is expecting just one element to have this role of text box, and now we have two elements that are satisfying that role. So if I scroll up, you can see it says found multiple elements with the role text box, right? So there are actually the regular input with a type of text right here that is satisfying that text box role, and now this h1 that also has a manually written explicit role of text box. And sometimes we want to use this role whenever we want to be more specific about the accessibility role that an element is playing. So once again, if, for example, we're using a div and it's supposed to represent a button, we might give it a role of button to indicate to screen readers that this is something that's meant to be clicked by the user. Of course, if it's meant to be clicked, it's better to use an HTML button element in the first place. But if you have to use a div for some reason, maybe for a visual organization or some kind of CSS styling, in that case, you can add a role of button to communicate that that div is playing that role, right? That it's meant to be something clickable by the user. So with that said, I'm going to remove this role right here. That was just for the sake of example. And I do want to point out that if we have an actual complex form, it's totally reasonable that we might have multiple text box roles, right? Imagine we have three different input fields, one for first name, another for last name, and another one for email address. Those are all inputs of type text. So this query right here will have the exact same failure that we saw a minute ago because React Testing Library will not be able to locate just one text box. It's going to locate three and say, I'm expecting to find one. So for those kinds of situations, what React Testing Library recommends is providing a second argument to getByRole. It's going to be a configuration object, so plain JavaScript object. And in here, we can add additional criteria that React Testing Library will use to search for a given element, or more specifically, an element by its role still. So we're still going to say search for an element with a role of text box, but here we can provide additional conditions for React Testing Library to look for. So the typical one that you're going to put here is a property called name. And what we give to name is the accessibility name of an element. Now this is kind of a little bit of a complex topic because it varies depending on what we're working with. But when we have an input with an associated label, as we have right here in app.js, the name is going to correspond to the label that the user sees. Remember, both accessibility and React Testing Library are focused on the user. How is the user going to interact with the site and how can we make it easier for them? The user is going to look for a label like email address to know that that is something that is meant to be typed into, right? So this name right here corresponds to the label of the input that is going to have that role of text box. So here I'm going to put a name of email address matching exactly what I have on the right-hand side. So we're basically saying, find me an input of type text, or in other words, find me a text box that belongs to the label email address, right? So going back to the example we had a minute ago, if we had three inputs, each one of them would have a different label and thus a different name. So this query right here would only work for one of those three, and thus we would not have a failure in comparison to simply querying for text box by itself. So you can see here we are console logging that exact same DOM node, the HTML input right here. If I scroll up, it's a whole bunch of output, but it is an HTML input element. So One thing that you're going to see throughout the React testing library documentation is an alternative way to write the syntax. What the developers there recommend is rather than using a string, they recommend using a regular expression. And if you don't know, a regular expression is just a search pattern for text, and it is built into the JavaScript language. The way we write it is like so. We do a / here and a / here in place of the original quotes. And if I save this, this should still work. But the reason they recommend using regular expressions is because we can add this additional character of I at the very end. And what that does is it performs a case-insensitive search. That means it's going to look for the text email address, but ignore the casing. So it's not going to care in the template whether email has a capital E or a capital M. It doesn't care which letters are capital or lowercase. It's going to look for any combination of the actual words email address anywhere in here. So of course this will work just fine because this is the exact matching right here. But if I, for example, change this to a lowercase e, you'll notice it's still going to find the input right here because the text for it is email address with a capital E. But here we said it doesn't matter what this is. It's going to be case insensitive. Just look for the text. Don't worry about the casing. So given that we're not going to worry about the casing, the most conventional way you're going to see this written in the test is going to be all lowercase, like so. And then in our actual application, it's whatever way we want to write it, right? We're just making the tests more resilient to change because that way, no matter how we write email address in our implementation, whether it's a capital E, a capital A, or both of them are capital, this one will continue to find that element regardless. So it's more resilient to change because it's more versatile, right? It supports a greater variety of ways that we could write email address in our implementation, right? You can see in our console, we are still finding our element. So that's all there is to cover in this lesson. We continued our discussion of the getByRole method. The getByRole method is invoked on the screen object, and it looks for an HTML element by its role. Remember, that role is associated with accessibility. It's not the literal HTML element. There is no text box HTML element, but there is a text box role, and it is implicitly granted by default to input elements with a type of text. So we were able to find it, the input with the association with the email address in the previous lesson, but we saw here how we can customize the getByRole method by providing a second argument of an object. And that object has a whole bunch of properties that can customize how React Testing Library will look for your given role or a given element with that role. But the most common property you'll use here is name, which for a text box is going to correspond to the name associated with the label for that text box. So this thing right here. So we're saying find an element that's playing the role of text box that has a name of email address. And as I mentioned, if you have 10 different inputs of type text, there's probably going to be only one with a label of email address. And so this is going to limit the results down to the one that you're trying to find. All right, so that is how we query, and we will continue exploring these concepts in greater depth as we proceed through the remainder of this section. So I will see you in the next lesson.